We are having Radhika Desai, who will talk about the global geopolitical economy of socialism, capitalism, crisis, and the state. I don't think Radhika needs a introduction. She's very famous in this field, and I think we can start just now. And how many minutes does she have for presentation?
40 minutes. And
40 minutes. Yes. You can have 40 minutes for presentation, and then we can discuss about your talk.
Okay, I was told 40 to 50 minutes, so that's what I've planned for, if that's okay. Okay, great. Well, let me start by sharing my screen here. Here we go. And I hope everyone can see that and I can get going. So I originally just gave the short title, The Geopolitical Economy of Socialism, but I felt that that topic was exceedingly large and I should actually deal with sort of one part of it. It's not a small part, as you'll see, but it is part of it. But I will also give you a broader understanding of what I mean by the geopolitical economy of socialism. So here we go. So at a time when capitalism appears to be in its senility and prospects of socialism never farther in the homelands of capitalism itself, it is critically important to realize that capitalism does not just have a political economy, but a geopolitical economy. By that I refer to the division of the world into nation states with differing power in extent and character, and of their interrelationships. The relations of producing nations, as Marx once put it. This division is not incidental, it's the product of capitalism, that is to say, of contradictory value production. And it requires us to question the consensus scenario that the left holds about the transition to socialism. For that too has had and will have a geopolitical economy in which different states in resisting capitalism and its inevitable accompaniment, imperialism, have been and will continue to advance differentially away from capitalism and over time establish relations of solidarity amongst themselves. In the past, it had taken the form of solidarity of the communist countries and other developing countries, for example. Today, we see it in the form, for instance, of alliances being forged between China, Russia, Venezuela, Cuba, Iran, and others. The consensus scenario, so what I mean by showing this slide is that, of course, the way the cosmopolitans, and I'll explain in a minute what they mean, people who think of the whole world economy as a seamless whole, the way they see the world is like this. There are no borders, there are no national borders in it, whereas the world, in fact, is like this, with very definite national borders, which are not just incidental to capitalism, they are very much a function of capitalism. The consensus scenario of the transition to socialism remains that inherited from the Second International. Revolution by working classes of Western countries, that is to say the homelands of capitalism, at capitalism's maturity so that they can redistribute the fruits of capitalism's development of the forces of production. Neither Marx nor Engels' writing, in fact, nor the historical record supports this view, and I have elaborated on this in numerous writings. Many think that the consensus scenario is best depicted in the Communist Manifesto, but not only did Marx and Engels indicate that the revolution would everywhere first be national and would advance, therefore, differentially in different countries. Already in the manifesto, they indicated that it would be better to smother capitalism in its European cradle before it had the chance to mature further. That is to say, they were not thinking of waiting for capitalism's maturity. As Eric Hobsbawm pointed out in his introduction to the 150th anniversary edition of the manifesto, that capitalism had barely begun to, essentially, to put it metaphorically, begun to put its boots on, even in Europe at the time that manifesto was written, let alone sort of striding onward. Even then, Marx and Engels indicated that the battle would be one in which each national proletariat, of each national proletariat with each national bourgeoisie. As is also well known, Marx and Engels recognized that many societies would be able to skip capitalism entirely and not be dragged through its blood and gore. And finally, they also demonstrated an awareness of how working classes of the West were affected by imperialism. Sorry. So not only did the actual record of world revolutions support the did the actual record of revolutions support the dominant image of transition. Revolutions have so far been made by alliances of workers and peasants in backward societies where capitalism was far from developed and where the main task of the revolution became willy-nilly to actually develop the forces of production. Oops. Yeah. The key to unlocking this disparity in the dominant conception of the transition to socialism on the one hand, and Marx and Engels' real vision and the historical record of revolution in the other, is to contest the cosmopolitan views of capitalism, which are basically the views such as free trade, globalization, US empire or hegemony, etc. They view the world as a seamless whole and consider its division into nation states irrelevant. Entirely contingent. We need to displace this understanding in favor of an understanding of the materiality of nation states in the discourse of Marxism. That has been the task of geopolitical economy. So that's the name of this book that I wrote some years ago, in which I basically think of geopolitical economy, as Marx put it in his writings on Henry Carey at the end of the Grundrisse, as the relations of producing nations, and the international plane as the grandest terrain on which the contradictions of capitalism appear in their grandest development. So in geopolitical economy, I show that nations are as material a product of capitalism's development as are classes, and for the same reason. They have to do with the contradictions of capitalism and the crises to which they give rise. Just as they give rise to class struggle, they also give rise to international struggle between nations. And that struggle takes the form of the dialectic of uneven and combined development between nations, imperialist nations and those who resist them with greater or lesser success. This dialectic of uneven and combined development unfolds as capitalism's dominant countries attempt to externalize the consequences of their capitalism's contradictions. Sorry. By subordinating other societies to receive excess commodities and capital and yield cheap labor and raw materials. Sorry, 1 second, please. Right. So the dominant countries attempt to externalize the consequences of their contradictions by subordinating societies to receive their excess commodities and capital, as well as yield cheap labor and raw materials. The threat and reality of subordination, however, elicits resistance. Imperial powers have sought complementarity between their own high-value production and the low-value production of colonies and semi-colonies. Contenders able and willing to resist have rejected such subordination and pursued industrialization in the only way possible, when earlier industrializers are already in command of the world market, through protectionism and state direction. And the aim of all this has been to achieve similarity of productive structures. So to reject complementarity and achieve similarity. So this attempt to impose complementarity and the attempt to resist it it constitutes the dialectic of uneven and combined development. At first, capitalist classes led such efforts at what Trotsky called combined development, or what can also be called contender development. Refusing to be Britain's agricultural appendages, the classic contender states, the United States, Germany, and Japan, industrialized via protectionist means. In 1917, the Russian Revolution blazed a new trail of socialist resistance, which China and other socialist states follow today. Such resistance includes less spectacularly successful cases such as India or Brazil, as well as Cuba and Vietnam, and these forms of resistance, rather than markets or imperialism, have spread productive capacity around the world. The original challenge of the classic contender states made the world multipolar, and capitalism's geopolitical economy has unfolded to reveal ever greater multipolarity since, not globalization or a succession of hegemonies. There is reason to believe that as this process unfolds, that all capitalisms have become more regulated, and secondly, that contender and challenger powers, which have historically pursued combined development, retain their more regulated character. I discussed this in a recent essay I wrote for the Japanese Political Economy on the US versus China economic models in the pandemic stress test, where China's economic model has been more resilient precisely because it is based on a contender model. And in particular, in this essay and in many of my other writings, I contrast the financial systems they have given rise to. A similar argument is based on this more popular piece of writing that I did, which I entitled "The Fate of Capitalism Hangs in the Balance of International Power," which is just another way of saying that the fate of capitalism hangs in the balance of geopolitical economy. That is to say, there is an international element to this. And interestingly, just yesterday, I happened to be attending Bob Brenner's presentation at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, in which he showed this slide. And since he circulated the slide, I'm using them. This is a demonstration of inequality, sort of going back to 1910 and up to the 1920s in the United States and the UK, where you can definitely see that after a brief dip during the golden age period, there's a rise again. So there is a sort of distinct U shape. Whereas in the cases of Germany, Japan, France, and Sweden, with different structures, more developmental contender structures, that level of inequality has never been restored to the same level, although there is certainly a big uptick here in Germany. But on the whole, there is a flatter thing, and there is no distinct U shape. So it shows that there are national differences, important national differences in capitalism. So in general, resisting contenders, whether we speak of Japan or Germany, capitalist powers like Japan or Germany, or socialist powers like the Soviet Union or PRC, they have had to create more productive economies than the dominant countries such as the US and the UK. Now, this gives you a sort of overall idea of what I mean by the geopolitical economy of capitalism and socialism, but outlining it all is a really vast task. So what I'm going to do today is focus on understanding capitalism crises and the materiality of nation states which arises from them and which is rooted in the contradictions of capitalism and its proneness to crisis. And so what I want to do now is give you a rather new and perhaps I would like to think the most systematic interpretation of capitalism and crises that I have seen and that I have developed over many years, in fact. So let's go into that. So capitalism, if we think about it, had an extremely bad 21st century, and that's a mark of its senility, really. The East Asian financial crisis of 1997-98 heralded it. The dot-com stock market crash of 2000 inaugurated it, and the 2008 financial crisis brought it to the brink of collapse. However, capitalist classes retained their grip on power, enabling neoliberal financialized capitalism, the result of the long unresolved long downturn dating back to the 1970s, to malinger strangely on. While neoliberal ideology went on celebrating capitalism, it clocked lower growth, generated greater inequality, and inflicted more devastating ecological damage than ever before. Millions of young people began striking school to demand governments and corporations act to halt the climate emergency, only to be interrupted by another disastrous result of capitalism's dysfunctional relation to nature, the 2020 novel coronavirus pandemic. The concatenation of public health, economic, financial, and ecological crises that accompanied it threaten complete social and political breakdown. So what is it with capitalism and crises? Capitalism's proneness to crises was apparent since its earliest days. Businessmen bemoaned glutted markets and falling profits, fearfully contemplated social and political consequences arising from unemployment or bank failures, hatched schemes to reform monetary and financial systems to prevent over or undersupply of money, etc. Last but not least, they plotted with political authorities to manage and, if necessary, crush workers' resistance and either colonize foreign territories or force other states to lift trade and financial barriers so as to export surplus commodity and capital, and import or export labor and access cheap inputs to avert crises. So all this was openly acknowledged in classical political economy. And this is the piece I did showing the relation between classical political economy that had preceded Marx and Marx's own theorization of capital. So all this was openly acknowledged in classical political economy, which emerged to comprehend the novel social form that was emerging, namely capitalism. It registered capitalism's paradoxes, its equally prolific production of riches and misery, its booms and its slumps, but combined its insights that only labor produced value or that capitalism was prone to regular gluts with confusion and conundrum. Only capitalism's greatest critic and analyst, Karl Marx, working with Friedrich Engels, resolved them in their unrivaled analyses. Marx's critical engagement with classical political economy portrayed, and by the way, I put this pre-capitalist economic formations next to Das Kapital because I think that the two are very closely related, because what you find in Capital is really Marx's understanding of a historically profoundly novel social formation. So that's something we should bear in mind. So Marx's critical engagement with classical political economy portrayed capitalism as a historically novel and deeply artificial social system, aiming to produce not the goods and services people needed, but value itself. Marx's analysis portrayed value production as a quixotic and contradictory enterprise, involving exploitation and competition, injustice and anarchy, that is to say, exploitation, injustice, competition, anarchy. However, Marx's work remained incomplete. He recognized and discussed, but did not fully develop another point. Capitalism required a practically impossible social systems that burden sociality itself to breaking point, while also involving societies in competition and conflict. The mass of contradictions stemming from capitalism's fragility, injustice, and anarchy regularly produced crises. They could only be managed by agencies outside the circuit of capital, usually the state, and such management modified capitalism's workings. However, such management could not eliminate capitalism's crises. They were fated to destroy it. Humanity faced a choice: either transform capitalism into a radically different society, creating a strong, just, orderly human society that produced what it needed, that is, some form of socialism, or humanity would go to capitalism's grave with it. The politically powerful were, of course, bound to oppose such a critique and did that with their support for neoliberalism, itself a refinement of long-standing denials of capitalism's contradictions and crises. By the 1870s, such denials, which Marx used to call vulgar economy, had coalesced into the marginalist revolution, which produced the neoclassical economics. So these are the three marginalists. They produced not only neoclassical economics, but thanks to Weber's sanctification of this new social division of labor, they separated the study of the so-called economy from the study of society, and also therefore produced the modern social, what I call the modern social scientific division of labor. neoclassical economics was theoretically and methodologically opposed to classical political economy and its critical culmination in Marx. Now, if that was all, matters would have been exceedingly simple. Clear blue intellectual water would have separated Marx's analysis on the left and neoclassical arguments on the right. Unfortunately, the waters are very muddy, and solid understanding of capitalism and its crisis must wade through these muddy currents to reach the shores of clarity. The reason they are muddy is that Marx's heirs only briefly challenged neoclassical economics directly, and I can think of three major works in which this was challenged. Rosa Luxemburg challenged the emergent understanding of Marx's volume 2, the reproduction schemas in volume 2, and rightly, I think, detected the influence of neoclassical economics, which she heavily criticized. Nikolai Bukharin thought of the neoclassical economics as the economic theory of the leisure class, and Hilferding wrote a critique of Bombauer's criticism of Marx. And all three are really worth reading and going back to and understanding. However, as neoclassical economics penetrated universities, more and more intellectuals were trained in it before arriving at Marxism. And they began to pursue what Bukharin called a policy of theoretical reconciliation between the two. Where it succeeded, this policy denatured Marx's legacy, replacing complex historical understanding in which human agency was central with the positivism of neoclassical economics. In any case, success in theoretically reconciling Marxism and neoclassical economics was bound to be limited. And these limits prompted Marxist economists, as these people who tried to practice reconciliation between the two called themselves, Marxist economists began to question one or other of the central aspects of Marx's critique, including his explanation of crises. So they would question whether Marx's value analysis really worked, whether Marx's key crisis mechanisms, did rates of profit actually fall? Was demand a problem? All these became questions. No wonder the greatest crisis of capitalism, the Great Depression of the 1930s, as much as the 2008 financial crisis and today, have found Marxism on the intellectual back foot, unable to challenge neoclassical economics or its latest avatar, neoliberalism. Later critics of capitalism, such as John Maynard Keynes or Karl Polanyi, were themselves trained in neoclassical economics and so mounted their critiques of capitalism on economics. And thanks to Marxist economics, they tended to assume that Marx was little different from neoclassical economics and saw themselves opposing Marx, even though in fact their understandings had strong links with Marx. So in what follows, I want to outline first how capitalism's contradictions and crises were analyzed by Marx and later critics such as Keynes and Polanyi, before going on to discuss the mechanisms of the sheer variety of crises that arise from capitalist value production and the social fragility that it necessarily creates. Marx got to the root of capitalism's novelty, which was surplus extraction through contradictory value production. If hitherto surplus had been forcibly extracted, how could it be extracted in capitalism with its voluntary market exchange? The answer lay in the precondition of capitalism, namely free wage labor. And of course, pre-capitalist social economic formations is nothing but a long discourse on how is it that historically such a strange thing as free wage labor would ever come into existence. So the answer lies in free wage labor. People with the paradoxical double freedom to work for chosen employers and freed from any other access to the means of livelihood, the land, through force and fraud. This privatization and commodification of land and labor represented the culmination of a long history of class exploitation and involved the state centrally. Market exchange, as it existed for centuries, was focused on acquiring useful objects. Commodities were exchanged for money in order to acquire more useful commodities, the CMC, Circuit of Commodities, as Marx represented it. Capitalism, however, as is well known, was based on generalized commodity production on the basis of another circuit, the circuit of capital, MC, M-, which began with money invested in production of commodities and ended with their sale for returning a greater sum than originally invested. The state was centrally implicated in organizing the near impossible conditions of this novel social structure. Where such conditions are established, the process is far from complete on a world scale even today. Exploitation takes a novel form. Workers are compelled to work for wages, and even when the justice of the market prevails, and capitalists buy labor power at its value, they extract surplus value simply because the value of what the worker produces is far in excess of what her labor is worth. The comparatively small amount needed to keep her and her family. If this were not the case, would the capitalist who seeks a return greater than the capital he invested bother to employ labor? Of course he would not. Many believe that Marx considered the resulting injustice, the vertical axis of value production, the private appropriation of the product of social labor, to be the most fundamental contradiction of capitalism. Finally, Marx showed how capitalists and other property owners struggle over the distribution of value through relentless competition between industrial capitalists and political struggle between them and the owners of land and money over the distribution of those profits. This anarchy forms the horizontal axis of value production. Competition determines the value of products, pushing down their price to their socially necessary level, below which existing knowledge and technology will not permit it to go, destroying weaker firms and enlarging larger ones in the process. Political struggle determines, by contrast, how much rentiers, the owners of land and money, are rewarded. No sooner had Marx published the core of this analysis than neoclassical economics emerges. Marx publishes Capital in 1867. Neoclassical economics' marginalist revolution is usually dated at 1870. So how do we go from vulgar economics to neoclassical economics? Well, it happened when Ricardo's conviction that value arose from labor was giving rise to Ricardian socialism. When Marx resolved classical political economy's outstanding questions into a major indictment of, sorry, I should just move this here. And by the way, I've covered what I'm about to say here in numerous writings. There are just 4 of these here, beginning with a 2010 article in Paul Zaremka's RPE on consumption demand in Marx and the current crisis, going on to publish The Value of History and the History of Value in Turan Subasat's edited volume, and then Capital at 150, a review I did of Capital at its 150th anniversary for the British radical magazine Red Pepper. And then most recently, this article in Third World Quarterly, Marx's Critique of Political Economy, Marxist Economics and Actually Occurring Revolutions Against Capitalism, which goes through exactly how, on the one hand, you get sort of a Brennerite position on revolutions in the Third World and a Sweezian position, and how both of them are complicit in Marxist economics and therefore compromise with neoclassical economics in one way or the other. So it may interest you to see these. Okay, so it happened when, so the shift happened to neoclassical economics when Ricardo's conviction that value arose from labor alone was giving rise to Ricardian socialism, when Marx resolved classical political economy's outstanding questions into a major indictment of capitalism, and when European working classes began organizing on a mass scale. Europe's capitalist classes could no longer politically afford the acknowledgements of capitalism's contradictions and antagonisms that were embedded in classical political economy and needed a more unambiguous justification of capitalism. The marginalist revolution of 1870 produced neoclassical economics as if on cue, refining and synthesizing what Marx had derided as vulgar economy, and produced facile justifications of capitalism. Whereas classical political economy and Marx studied capitalist society as historically distinct and an evolving whole, made and unmade by the struggles of classes, parties, and states, vulgar economy had insisted on laissez-faire. And neoclassical economics separated the economy as a distinct social realm with its own laws. Unlike Marx's dialectical laws, Made and unmade by human actions, neoclassical laws were like those of nature, externally imposed only to be obeyed. Max Weber, originally trained in neoclassical economics, constructed a veritable new social scientific division of labor around the economy, arguing that modern capitalist societies differentiate into autonomous spheres whose specific laws need separate study through separate disciplines such as economics, sociology, political science, etc. The generality of his argument notwithstanding, however, it was the economy's autonomy that he worried about the most. In this separate economic realm, neoclassical economics narrowed the focus of analysis to exchange, leaving out production, to prices, leaving out values, to the agency of individuals, leaving out classes and political action. This erased the problem of injustice and exploitation, and which requires attention to production. As for anarchy, neoclassical economics bought into two fictions. The first is Say's law, that there could be no gluts in markets, which was a critically important step in denying capitalism's contradictions and crises, and David Ricardo's conception of comparative advantage, purporting to show against all evidence that free trade and competition and specialization that it was based on were beneficial to all nations, thereby erasing the international contradictions of capitalism. Thus, neoclassical economics gave rise to ahistorical capitalism, stable, eternal, and unchanging. It was also cosmopolitan, conceiving of a seamlessly unified world whose division into rich and poor nations was irrelevant. Now we lost the central plot of class and national struggles and competition that makes capitalism's tumultuous history intelligible. Neoclassical economics has been the gift to Western capitalism that keeps on giving. It eliminates discussion of capitalism's fragility, injustice, and anarchy, permitting capitalists to keep control over the economy and the pace and pattern of growth, irrespective of performance. I mean, quite frankly, if you ask me, capitalism had already outlived its utility a long time ago, but that is certainly becoming more clear than ever today. The autonomy of the economy is conveniently invoked against state interventions favoring labor, even as those, that is to say, state interventions in favor of capital proliferate, thanks not least to its contradictions and internal crises. Now, after this neoclassical economics, post-neoclassical critics of capitalism emerged. And so neoclassical economics may have changed the discourse about capitalism, but not capitalism itself. And new critiques therefore continue to emerge. Take Keynes and Polanyi. John Maynard Keynes mounted arguably the next greatest, that is to say, next to Marx, the greatest indictment of capitalism, through a critique of neoclassical economics amid the economic turbulence of two world wars and a Great Depression. Keynes and Marx are frequently contrasted as reformist and revolutionary, respectively. However, not only is the intellectual relationship stronger than is usually imagined, for instance, Keynes derived his early critiques of Say's law from Marx's distinction between the circuits of commodities and capital. The analyses are remarkably similar. Both focused on the working class, both criticized Say's law and comparative advantage, and both pointed to surfeits of commodities and capital as problems. Karl Polanyi criticized capitalism for treating land, labor, and money as commodities, even though they were not. It led to the double movement, the spread of markets and the response of social reform. Neither this argument itself nor its connection with Marx are clearly understood. In reality, both classical political economy and Marx appreciated well enough that land, labor, and money were not commodities. Special laws determined their prices. They were not determined as by the same laws as by which the prices of commodities were determined. The term fictitious commodities had become necessary by the time of Polanyi because it was necessary as a way of questioning the tendency of neoclassical economics to treat everything that was offered for sale as a commodity. The ravages of commodification of the main elements of production had led in the 19th century, according to Polanyi, to the double movement, but now it required consciously organized socialism. So now we're ready to look at crises and that arise from capitalist contradictions, and how and why they make the state very material. So before we go on to do that, I want to note 4 things about capitalism and crises. First, contrary to neoclassical economics, there is not and cannot be a pure and purely economic capitalism. Capitalism is everywhere born in non-capitalist societies and can never entirely transform them. As Engels put it in his 1895 letter to Conrad Schmidt, complete capitalism does not exist even in England and never will exist. Revolutionaries like him, he added, would never let it go so far as that. No actually existing capitalism resembles the contradictory mechanisms of value production in capital in full. That is, there are many modifications that take place. Secondly, in Capital, Marx was focused on showing how capitalism extracts surplus value and how it is distributed among the non-working classes, even when capitalism is on its best behavior and equal values are exchanged on the market. However, he knew very well that capitalism frequently employs force and fraud and harnesses pre-existing hierarchies, whether of gender or race, or harnesses the newfound force of the state for its gains. Thirdly, Marx analyzed myriad mechanisms of crises. Usually, more than one was at work in any given historical crisis, interacting with others in complex ways. Finally, these crisis mechanisms and the pressures they generate force states to act, to mitigate them through actions of domestic repression or reform and of international expansion or imperialism. These actions further ensure that capitalism is not and can never be a purely economic system, but a political economy domestically, and on the international plane, not a global economy seamlessly unified by markets, but a geopolitical economy in which states and their interrelationships and their struggles are central. Marx identified a range of crisis mechanisms and examined some more fully than others because tragically his work remained uncompleted. Ernest Mandel identified overproduction or underconsumption, disproportionality, and the tendency of the rate of profit to fall as distinct crisis mechanisms in Marx's work. Paul Sweezy likewise identified crises associated with falling rates of profit and realization. But we will take a wider and more systematic view. Oh, sorry, I should add that in this article on Polanyi, I showed the connection between Polanyi's conception of fictitious commodities, Polanyi's conception of money as a fictitious commodity, and its relation to Marx's work. But let me go on to this. This is my last slide, and I will conclude. Well, not soon, but this is the last third, I would say, of my presentation. So Mandel and Sweezy recognize crises in production and in circulation. However, capitalism relies on the right conditions in at least 5 other realms. So let me just say here that I have here across here the realms that are necessary for capitalist production to occur. And here there are 2 forms that crises take. It can take an intra-class form involving the horizontal contradictions of capitalism, which are embedded in competition, or it can take inter-class form, which is the vertical axis of capitalism, which involves exploitation. So there is horizontal intra-capitalist competing with capitalists and vertical capitalist exploiting workers. And then each of these things takes a certain form, which I will describe as I go along. So value is expressed. So there are, in addition to production and realization, there are at least 5 other realms that are involved. Value is expressed and critically in capitalism preserved in money, and states must furnish money of stable value. Money is inseparable from credit, and states must ensure that financial systems function to facilitate accumulation. Further, capitalism relies on states to create and maintain the legal and political framework of private property, to secure its growth and manage its crises. Internationally, the unevenness of capitalist development and the imperial pressures generated by dominant states calls forth the response of combined development, protectionist industrialization, whether capitalist as in Germany, US, or Japan, or communist as in the Soviet Union or today in China. The resulting dialectic of uneven and combined development ensures that the plurality of nation states ensures the plurality of nation states and competition, struggle, and conflict between them. Essentially, under capitalism, an impossibly high number of independently operating components of the system have to come together just right for it to function. That they will not is a fatal certainty. And that's why you get recurring crises and very complex crises. Finally, like all other modes of production, capitalism relies on the free resources nature provides. In each of these 7 spheres, crises may take 2 forms: the intra-class or horizontal form arising from competition and struggles between property-owning classes, and the inter-class or vertical form arising from class struggle. So these 7 sources and 2 forms give us at least 14 different types of crises. Let us take them in turn. There is the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, because in competing for market share, capitalists must invest in cost-reducing technology. The first mover enjoys increased profits for a time because it can sell above its new lower cost while remaining below competitors' still higher costs. Some competitors go bankrupt in the process, but others catch up by making similar investment. As they do, the rate of profit in that sector goes back to the normal or average unless counteracted temporarily by one or more counteracting factors. Those who dismiss the tendency of the rate of profit to fall argues that no capitalist would invest unless it increased his profits. This is the Marxist economics explanation of or contestation of this idea. However, Marx's argument was that capitalists may be forced to introduce new machinery in order to keep his market share or even to save his firm from bankruptcy, and that no capitalist knows in advance what the result of this decision to buy new machinery will be. Both Marx and Keynes considered falling profits a secular trend, punctuated but not reversed by upticks, weakening over time the impulse to invest. The resulting surfeit of capital would spell the obsolescence of capitalism and capitalists. However, exactly how it contributes to crisis is not entirely clear. While Marxists squabble over how exactly to measure the profit rate and how how profit rates slow investment sufficiently to constitute a crisis, while Marxists squabble over how exactly to measure the profit rate, how profit rates slow investment sufficiently to constitute a crisis remains unclear. Certainly, differences in profit rates explain why capital shifts from less to more profitable sectors. However, can it explain rises or falls in aggregate investment? In any capitalist country with a reasonably developed financial system, low average profits should hardly be a barrier to investment and may even be a spur if promising new technology appears. And high profits in a situation of low demand and profit expectations only leads capitalists to hoard their money as financial investment, which simply increases the amount of capital seeking a share of existing returns from productive investment, and therefore putting more downward pressure on profit rates. Keynes had emphasized that investment is motivated by profit expectations as much as existing profit rates. While the most ambitious effort so far to explain the long downturn since the 1970s in terms of declining profit rates attributes the latter to overproduction and overcapacity in relation to existing levels of demand, which is an entirely different mechanisms. So that's about the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. Profits are squeezed when rising wages reduce the rate of exploitation and profits. Many Marxists dismiss profit squeezes theoretically by showing that rates of exploitation can rise even when profits are falling, and empirically by noting other factors, particularly international price pressures, explained by that explain most of the decline in profitability between 65 and 73, as Brenner does, for instance. Neither argument demonstrates, however, that rising wages cannot decrease profit rates, and they did threaten profits, at least in some countries in the economic crisis of the 1970s, as productivity growth slowed. And this partly explains the ferociousness of the attack on labor that ensued. Crisis of competition in circulation. Now we're into the next one here. are classic symptoms of capitalist anarchy, leading to disproportionate production between sectors. For instance, too much production of investment goods, too little of consumption goods, or vice versa, the too many shirts to too few tractors problem. However, crises in circulation arising from the injustice of this is overproduction slash underconsumption. And by the way, we can discuss this later, but I use the two terms interchangeably. Crisis in circulation arising from the injustice of exploitation is far weightier. There is always a gap between what workers are paid, the value of their labor power, and what they produce. And since there is no guarantee that the capitalist who appropriates the rest will spend it, whether on lavish consumption or investment, there is never any guarantee that all the goods arriving on markets will be sold, and periodic gluts are inevitable. They signify overproduction in relation to existing demand, or underconsumption in relation to existing production. Though many Marxists prefer the former label to the latter, it should be clear that they are interchangeable. Certainly, Marx believed that the ultimate reason of all crises remains the poverty and restricted consumption of the masses. In emphasizing that high wages and full employment were necessary to prolong, if not ultimately stabilize capitalism, Keynes was not far behind. Marxist economists who deny that paucity of consumption demand is a crisis mechanism propose that capitalism can be a never-ending production of producers' goods. However, while investment and consumption demand together make up aggregate demand, investment demand for production goods relies on the demand for final or consumption goods. As Marx pointed out, the production of constant capital, that is investment goods, is ultimately limited by the consumption demand for the production of constant production of constant capital never takes place for its own sake, but simply because more of it is needed in those spheres of production whose products go into individual consumption. We now leave the spheres of value production and realization and venture out into their preconditions. Capitalism inherits the social institution of money, but requires it to behave like a commodity. It must rely on states to create money, even as it suspects states of devaluing money for their own political convenience. It needs money to retain its value, even though its own dynamics lead to fluctuations in their value. Competition which pushes prices down unrelentingly tends towards deflation, increasing the value of money and reducing the inducement to invest. While commodities tend to decline in value as capitalism develops, the fictitious commodities, land, labor, and money, whose prices are determined by their own special laws, can lead to inflation, devaluing money. Cost push inflation occurs due to high bargaining strength of labor or primary commodity producers. Meanwhile, the mismanagement of money by states can also lead to inflation. Within limits, inflation acts as a spur to spending and also to investment, and therefore can stimulate production. Beyond a point, however, it undermines both. All money, so now we're on to the next one, finance. All money already being debt, the realm of capitalist finance is that of private credit. It appears to be just another form of economic activity. However, it produces nothing and must rely on skimming off other incomes, whether wages, profits, or rent. And though it appears to be governed by markets, it must be heavily regulated and supported by the state. This became glaringly clear when states and central banks bailed out financial institutions in numerous recent financial crises. In the realm of finance, the horizontal crisis mechanisms can be credit crunches, one set of capitalists, such as bankers, being unwilling to lend, whether to other bankers or to productive investors, as in 2008. And asset bubbles as capitalists compete to corner returns for their idle capital through speculation in asset markets, leading to ever-thinning margins, requiring ever more leveraged money to be thrown into speculation, as happened in the 2008 housing and credit bubbles. Asset bubbles eventually burst, of course, causing crashes. In the vertical or interclass plane, the most common financial crises are mortgage crises, which occur with high default rates of credit extended for consumption to workers whose wages are insufficient to service the debt. The recent so-called subprime crisis in the United States was an important but not the only instance. Mortgage crises also preceded the crash of 1929. In the state of political realm, fiscal crises typically result from capitalists competing to offload costs of the state running their common affairs onto one another, as by seeking tax cuts, and to appropriate the benefits of public action such as subsidies. Such competition handicaps the state in ensuring accumulation. Tax cuts for the rich are made in the hope that they will invest, create jobs and increase state revenues, but the hope has rarely been fulfilled. The resulting fiscal crises, revenues falling short of expenditures, usually result in curtailing social spending first, which further contributes to declines in growth as well as legitimacy. This is precisely the form of interclass political crises, the result of one or more of capitalism's contradictions and antagonisms becoming acute and requiring concessions unwelcome to or intolerable to capital. So that would be the legitimation crisis, which in order to address it, the state may have to make unacceptable concessions. I'll be done in a couple of minutes, a few minutes, yeah, couple of minutes. In capitalism's international relations, so we're now here, the geopolitical economy of capitalism that Marx termed the relations of producing nations, the very plurality of states reflecting that of capitals guarantees crises. They take an intra-capitalist form when they arise from competition between nationally organized blocks of capital, of advanced country capital, such as competition for colonies that culminated in the First World War, which was also, of course, a competition for markets. In our own time, they compete for limited markets of the sort that Brenner blames for the onset of the long downturn. And they also compete for investment opportunities, resources, and labor. Geopolitical crisis of the interclass form typically can be traced to refusals of less developed periphery countries to provide outlets for advanced country capital and commodities, and of course also to deliver up their labor and commodities cheaply. So the oil price increases of the 1970s, for example, or more contemporary surges in commodity prices are examples. And they can also, of course, these peripheral states can also resist by undertaking their own development in capitalist forms such as in India or Brazil or South Korea, or in socialist forms such as in the Soviet Union or China today. Finally, on the ecological plane, on a planetary scale, the capitalist organization of production and labor, what Marx calls the metabolism with nature, has everywhere led to the degradation of the very earth that guarantees our existence, that guarantees production in the first place. And fantasies of certain maverick colonists, capitalists of colonizing space are here quite irrelevant. Here too, the two axes of value production result in two distinct forms of ecological damage. Competition among capitalists to simply produce and sell more and more products and services, and to persuade people falsely that they need them. And corner resources to do so result in the abuse and overuse of resources and land, pollution, reduction in biodiversity, and climate change. On the class exploitation axis, working people everywhere are forced to denude nature. For example, whether for firewood or land for houses, agriculture, pasture, such as, or other things such as unregulated waste dumps, because they are left with an ever shrinking share of the social product and of land. The environmental issue is usually framed in terms of economic growth and population. The real problem is the capitalist organization of our metabolism with nature. So in conclusion, one can safely say that all these mechanisms involve fundamental processes of capitalist production and reproduction, and they contain the possibilities of crises. Every major crisis is a complex amalgam of more than one of these. If the argument of my lecture today is accepted, readers will see that the historically novel fragility Injustice and anarchy of capitalism was noted by the earliest observers of capitalism. And Marx laid the foundation for a larger, coherent understanding of capitalism in his incomplete work. And later critics of capitalism have also added elements to our understanding in ways that built on Marx's understanding. The picture we get is of capitalism as a social form that requires so many things to go just right all at once that its smooth functioning is an impossibility, leaving it perpetually prone to crisis on practically every front, which must in the end be managed by states, which is why they are a material phenomena and not merely a cultural phenomenon. So I'm sorry I went on for a bit longer than I had hoped, but there it is. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for your enlightening presentation. I especially liked the part in which you elaborated the many sides of capitalist crisis, especially in the contemporary capitalism. Yes, I'd like to invite some comments and questions from the audience. Yes, if you have any questions, please. Oh, you can write your question on the chatting chatting panel. Yes. You can speak. You can write. Yeah. Oh, you just speak, and yes, David. Yes, please.
I have a small question. I'm fascinated by the breadth of the coverage and the survey of literature. It's amazing. I'll have to read it at some point, get the whole thing. But what I would like a little more explanation, perhaps, is the specific focus of geopolitical economy on this history. A lot of this is our general Marxist tradition, you know, and non-Marxist contributors to that brought together. So I guess my question is, if one is talking about Bomberwerk and Hilferding and Polanyi and Keynes and so forth and so on, and Marx and Engels and the controversies around the falling rate of profit, etc. How does it make a difference in putting all this together as the background in which we think about today's world? To think about it from the standpoint of geopolitical economy. What is specifically geo about it? I'm not assuming that there's necessarily a final answer to that question. It's an open question.
Oh, well, sure. I mean, there is a very simple answer to that question to begin with, and then you can tell me if that is, you know, it's not enough. But the simple answer is that the dominant understandings, including dominant Marxist understandings, behave as though states play no role in. And what I'm doing is I'm putting the role of states both in the management of societies domestically and economies domestically in a larger framework in which this management also has international implications. And I sort of essentially theorize the motivations of states in terms of their international engagement. And I point out that managing the contradictions of capitalism, so the imperatives generated for states, both in terms of the domestic action and the international action, are rooted in the contradictions of capitalism. And when I do that, I also come up against the problem that the idea that capitalism has contradictions, etc., is contested by many people who call themselves Marxist economists. So then I sort of go off and I say, well, this is a problem, that there is actually a very clear understanding in Marx of the contradictions of capitalism. And that's why, I mean, in one of my slides, I showed a whole bunch of different writings that I've done in which I have both expanded and refined my critique of existing Marxist economics. So the fact of the matter is that Marxist economics tends to discount this. And that is partly why it discounts the matter of states, because the contradictions of capitalism and the materiality of states are very closely related. And then that gives us a broader framework, a Marxist framework for understanding what drives the relations of producing nations, as Marx put it. Does that make sense? So the key is the state. And that's why I also sort of I've gone in order to make these points, which I thought to me were quite simple, because I approached it simply by reading Capital. And then I realized that there are all these people who read neoclassical economics first, they arrive at it through another angle, and they have a completely different interpretation. And I simply do not find that it matches what Marx says. So I've shown, for instance, so in the most recent of these writings, which I can send anybody who's interested, I show that, whether you are a Brennerite or you are a Sweezyite, in a slightly different way, you misunderstand what Marx was saying. So there it is. And this has implications for understanding world affairs, because it has implications for understanding imperialism, which is world affairs. So in my book, for example, I realized as I was writing it, so I said it, I said the classical theories of imperialism of the generation of Hilferding and Luxemburg and Lenin and so on, they were the first serious theories of international relations. And when I took international relations, I was taught that international relations was born after the First World War, when Wilson came up with his idealism, and then it was, poor fellow, his idealism was put to the test of realism and blah, blah, and crap like that. No, the first theories of modern international relations were these works, because they tried to understand how nations relate to one another under capitalism. And what is it specifically about capitalism that governs international relations?
Okay.
So, yeah.
Yeah. In the meantime, Seongjin raised some questions.
Yes, actually, I'm happy to read them and answer them if you want.
Yes, actually, there are three questions.
Three questions, okay. So the first question is that the overview of geopolitical economy, critique of Marxist economics, and reconstruction of Marxist theories of crisis, combining 2 axes and 7 sources, are wonderful and very helpful. And I want to say thank you, Seongjin, because to me, this is really, like in this talk, that is what I have to contribute does not come from the details I said, but in that larger framing that I did. That's my contribution. So, and you have 3 questions. One is whether you include Soviet Marxist economics textbook in your list of Marxist economics, which you criticize. You've got me there. I would have to read one first to answer that question. And I have not read a Soviet Marxist economics textbook, although I would not be surprised if it had some connection with what I'm criticizing, because when I first began to do this, my partner and my husband and partner, Alan Freeman, he and Andrew Kleinman had already been discussing, Borkiewicz and so on. But when I started reading about this, I found that the earliest known influence of neoclassical economics on Marx and Marxist economics goes back to Mikhail von Tugan-Baranovsky. So that is much earlier. So no sooner is neoclassical economics born than Baranovsky is basically saying Marx's value analysis does not work, that it has a transformation problem, that the rate of profit does not fall, and that demand is not a problem. So all of these 3 things, which are to me themes that continue to recur in so-called Marxist economics, are already there in the form in which they will persist in Tugan-Baranovsky. So he was influenced by that. And I know that from work that Paul Zaremka has done, for instance, that this influence also extended to other Marxists of the time. So Lenin was not uninfluenced by it. I would say that even though I praise Hilferding for, defending Marx, there are points at which he seems to, and I cover this in my one of my articles. There are points at which he seems to accept the neoclassical economics argument. So nobody was quite untouched. There were very few people who were untouched, and this is a big problem. So as I say, I will, if you send me a Soviet Marxist economics textbook, then I will let you know. Secondly, it seems that I'm very generous to Polanyi and Keynes than Marxist economics. Okay, do I have issues with Karl Polanyi? You know, I read Polanyi back in the 90s, and then I did a lot more intensive work on, I did more intensive work on him when I was writing my book, and then subsequently, I did even more work on him. So now I feel that, first of all, Polanyi himself was not kind to Marx. He would often criticize Marx, like Keynes did. Keynes was often dismissive of Marx, but there are underlying connections. So take the example of, take the idea of fictitious commodities. Now, first of all, when you read Polanyi, he does not reference anybody. But Gareth Dale, who is going to speak in your series, has shown that Polanyi gets the idea from Ferdinand Tönnies and his Community and Society. Now, until this point, I had never read Tönnies before. Like, I knew, I had been taught that, you know, Tönnies comes up with the concept of community and society, Gemeinschaft, Gesellschaft, etc., fine. But I then sat down and read Community and Society from cover to cover. Several interesting things about it. Yes, he does not quite, he uses, basically, Tönnies uses the term fictitious commodities in such a way as to make you realize that he doesn't have to insist on it, that people are using this idea. And I was on a panel with a couple of other Polanyi scholars and neoclassical economics scholars. I forget, I think one of them was Klaus Thomasberger, but I forget who else it was. But anyway, we had this very interesting discussion. Oh, I will tell you, it was an Italian guy. His name will come to me in a minute. Anyway, and we had this very interesting discussion, and we basically concluded that because neoclassical economics was assuming that land, labor, and money were also commodities just like anything else, people had to find a way of saying, well, no, they're not quite, because their prices are determined in different ways, not according to the normal commodity production, etc., price formation. So they took it for granted that, okay, if you're going to call them commodities, we're at least going to resist by calling them fictitious commodities, because you have to differentiate these. And so Tönnies uses this. So that's the first thing. The second thing is Tönnies' book contains, and I'll give you the pages if you want, 2 pages, just 2 pages, succinct, lucid discussion of how there is no transformation problem in Marx. No. There is no transformation problem. You don't have to write gazillion equations. It's not there because it's logically not there. And my own view is that the transformation problem has been Ricardo's problem. It has not been Marx's problem. Okay. So I don't feel I'm being kind to Polanyi. Keynes is a different matter. So I feel that, first of all, I think that Keynes, there was a lot in common between Keynes and Marx. And again, Alan and I wrote a piece about that many years ago. You know, after the 2008 crisis, everybody was talking about how Keynes is back and so on. So we wrote our own little thing about it. And it does point to many commonalities between them. And I would say one other thing, which is that whatever else Keynes got wrong about Marx, and he got many things wrong about Marx, but because he got them wrong about Marx, he ended up reinventing the wheel in a number of different ways. So there is that. And the second thing is that he considered the distinction between the circuit of commodities and the circuit of capital by Marx. That he knew Marx, he thought it was a stroke of genius, that it explained an enormous amount. And Claudio Sardoni has written about this. He even says that Keynes wrote early drafts of the general theory in terms of these, and then changed the draft because he realized that the intervention of neoclassical economics between Marx and him had changed the terrain on which the argument could be mounted, and therefore he then changed the form of his argument. So Keynes is less good definitely than Marx because he was a darn imperialist and all those things, but we will leave those things aside. Marx was a far far better intellectual and a radical. And Keynes had a completely wrong idea about how to effect political change. He thought, like Bentham, that if you sort of appeal to the powers that be, that they will change their policies. And he clearly had no idea about such things. Okay. And then your third question is, my attempt to compare and reconstruct a unified Marxist theory of crisis is insightful, but however, it seems to elide crucial differences and age-old confrontations among various historic Marxist theories of crisis. Do you think that multiple theses of crisis in Marx, underconsumption, disproportionality, tendency of rate of profit to fall, etc., can be made compatible with each other? Okay, I've dealt with this, is the unified consistent theory. So my own view is that in Marx, there are many types of crises. And I think that they are all totally consistent with what I call his understanding of capitalism as contradictory value production, or the sense of capitalism as contradictory value production, with a horizontal axis of exploitation, vertical axis of exploitation, horizontal crisis of horizontal axis of competition, and the two work together to produce capitalism, and then how it relates to them. So to me, all the different types of that's four types of crises, because there is in the realm of production and realization. So in my first work on this that I wrote, which I called Consumption Demand in Marx and in the Current Crisis, which was in 2010, I do one thing. I say that I criticize Marxist economists, among other things. I criticize them for many things, but one of the things I criticize them for is what I call their monomania. They are all fighting with each other. This is the most fundamental theory. No, this is the most fundamental contradiction. This is the most, no, tomorrow we can have a capitalist crisis that, right now we're having a capitalist crisis that emerges out of our dysfunctional relationship with nature. Now, none of these Marxist economists are going to, they didn't even dream about it. Or the 2008-9 financial crisis. I mean, it was triggered by entirely financial mechanisms. So I would say that this search for the most fundamental crisis mechanism is, I don't think Marx would have agreed with it. Insofar as he did agree with it, he said it was the poverty and restricted consumption of the masses. That is the only line in which he unambiguously says this is the ultimate source of all crises. And you could make a case for that, but I would say that even if you made a case that that is the most fundamental crisis mechanism, in the end, it does not matter, because the fundamental crisis mechanism will not, have time to, the moment of the fundamental crisis may be preempted by any one of other crises, which will be equally consequential for humanity. And unless we solve the problem of capitalism, we're not going to get beyond that. So I would say that, yes, therefore, I do think they can be unified in a consistent theory. And I feel that I have done so in a way that does absolutely no violence to Marx. I think it is, if you read Capital, rather than, as I say, read Marxist economics, I don't think there would be any problem. That's what I believe.
Any further response from Seongjin? No? Okay.
Sorry, maybe I've sort of ranged over too many different things. And but if I had given my whole account of the geopolitical economy of socialism, it would have been about 10 times wider, the canvas. So.
Okay. Is there anybody who will have some comments or questions? If there isn't, I think we can conclude today's talk.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and thanks to everyone for attending. And yeah, and I guess I will just write my email here if you would like to get in touch with me.
Thank you.
I would love to hear from anyone here who may have questions later on or something. That would be great.
Yeah, thank you very much, Radhika, for the wonderful talk. And yeah, thank you very much for everyone for joining us to make this our global SSK Global Marxism online talk.
Great.
Yes, I think this is a very difficult time for radical Marxists, but yeah, we have also this kind of wonderful opportunity to exchange our views and our thoughts online.
Absolutely. I think the pandemic has made sort of international contact so much easier. We don't see our neighbors, but we are talking to people from halfway around the world more easily. So it's good for something. So
yes, yeah. Actually, SSK Global Marxism online talk continues. When is the next?
I think David is on next, aren't you?
Oh, yes.
Yes.
Tuesday.
Yes, Tuesday, May 4.
Yeah, I hope to see you all on Tuesday again. And yeah, thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah.
Thank
you. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you.
Thank you, Radhika.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.